before the world knew him as Lenin, he was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He was not born in a prison. He was not raised in an underground revolutionary cell. He did not grow up among starving factory workers or hunted political exiles. He was born into a comfortable and educated family in the provincial Russian city of Simbirsk. His father served the imperial education system. His mother maintained a disciplined and cultured household. The young Vladimir was intelligent, competitive, and exceptionally focused. At school, he earned excellent marks. He respected order. He followed rules. And for much of his childhood, there was little to suggest that he would one day dedicate his life to destroying the political system under which his family had prospered. Yet beneath the calm surface of Imperial Russia, another world was forming. The empire was enormous. It stretched across Europe and Asia. It contained dozens of peoples, languages, religions, and historical grievances. At its center stood the Romanov monarchy. The Tsar ruled through ministers, officials, police, soldiers, censorship, and an elaborate bureaucracy. Russia had abolished serfdom in 1861, but freedom had not created equality. Millions of peasants remained poor. Land hunger continued. Industrial cities were beginning to expand. Workers labored for long hours under harsh conditions. Political opposition was restricted. Those who challenged the state could be watched, arrested, exiled, or executed. Vladimir did not understand all of this as a child. His earliest world was his family. He was born on April 22nd, 1870, according to the modern calendar. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, had risen through education and government service. He believed deeply in schooling and worked to expand educational opportunities across the region. The family lived respectably with books, music, study, and a strong expectation of achievement. Vladimir's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was educated and resilient. She would eventually endure the death of her husband, the execution of one son, the imprisonment and exile of several of her other children, and the transformation of Vladimir into one of the most hunted revolutionaries in Europe. But in the early years, the Ulyanov home was not a revolutionary headquarters. It was a household of discipline and ambition. Vladimir loved reading. He performed well in classical languages and literature. He could be stubborn, but he also possessed unusual powers of concentration. Teachers recognized his ability. His future appeared secure. He might study law. He might enter state service. He might become another successful member of Russia's educated professional class. Then, within little more than a year, the stability of the family collapsed. In January 1886, Ilya Ulyanov died suddenly. Vladimir was 15. The death removed the central authority of the household. But a far greater shock was still to come. Vladimir's older brother, Alexander, was a gifted university student in St. Petersburg. Serious, idealistic, and increasingly radical, Alexander became involved with a revolutionary group influenced by the tradition of the people's will. This movement believed that the autocratic system could be shaken by direct attacks against its rulers. Its members had already assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. The killing did not destroy the monarchy. Instead, Alexander III came to power and strengthened political repression. Alexander and his associates began preparing another assassination attempt. Their target was Alexander III. The plot failed before it could be carried out. The conspirators were arrested. Alexander was offered opportunities to appeal for mercy, but he refused to abandon responsibility for his actions. In May 1887, he was executed by hanging. He was 21 years old. Vladimir was 17. The execution became one of the defining events of his life. But it would be misleading to imagine that Vladimir instantly became Lenin at the moment his brother died. His transformation was slower, more intellectual, and, in the long term, more dangerous to the imperial state than Alexander's failed bomb plot. The family now carried the stigma of treason. Friends could become distant. Officials could become suspicious. The respected son of an educational administrator was now the brother of a convicted revolutionary. Vladimir did not forget this humiliation. He also studied his brother's failure. Alexander had been brave. He had been willing to die. But courage had not brought victory. A small group had tried to remove one ruler. The state had discovered them, executed them, and continued to exist. Vladimir would eventually reject individual assassination as an effective revolutionary strategy. Killing a czar did not automatically destroy the system that produced czars. Another ruler could take his place. Another police chief could issue orders. Another prison could receive the next generation of rebels. The entire structure had to be understood, organized against, and overthrown. Only months after Alexander's execution, Vladimir entered Kazan Imperial University to study law. He arrived with outstanding academic credentials, but his family name followed him. The university existed under close political supervision. Student gatherings could be treated as threats. Young people debated reform, autocracy, revolution, and Russia's future. Vladimir soon participated in a student protest. The authorities acted quickly. He was expelled from the university and sent away from Kazan under police surveillance. His formal university career had barely begun. The empire had closed one path before him. For many young men, expulsion might have led to defeat. For Vladimir, it created isolation. And isolation gave him time to read. At the family's rural residence, he began studying more systematically. He read Russian revolutionary writers. He encountered the populist tradition that had influenced his brother. The populace believed that Russia's peasantry and village communities might provide a path toward socialism without passing fully through Western capitalism. Some went among the peasants to educate and organize them. Others embraced terrorism. Vladimir respected their sacrifice, but he became increasingly dissatisfied with their methods and assumptions. Russia was changing. Railways were expanding. Factories were growing. Markets were transforming village life. A new industrial working class was emerging. To understand that change, Vladimir turned toward Karl Marx. Marx offered him something that the heroic tradition of individual revolutionaries did not: a system, a theory of history, a way to connect economics, politics, class, and power. Marx argued that societies were shaped by material production and class conflict. Capitalism was not simply a collection of greedy individuals. It was a historical system with its own structures, pressures, and contradictions. For the young Vladimir, this was a revelation. The enemy was larger than one czar, larger than one minister, larger even than the Russian monarchy. The struggle was embedded in the organization of society itself. Vladimir studied law independently and was eventually permitted to take examinations through St. Petersburg University. In 1891, he obtained his law qualification. He briefly worked in the legal profession in Samara, but the courtroom would not become his true arena. He attended discussion circles, studied political economy, argued with populists, and absorbed the works of Marx and Russian Marxist thinkers such as Georgy Plekhanov. The disciplined schoolboy was disappearing. In his place stood a young revolutionary intellectual. He had not yet created the Bolshevik Party. He had not yet adopted the name Lenin. He had not yet experienced prison, Siberian exile, or the long years of political life abroad. But the essential elements of his character were already visible. He believed that history followed forces that could be studied. He believed successful revolution required organization rather than isolated heroism. He distrusted political compromise. He worked with extraordinary concentration. And he had begun to see himself not merely as a critic of the Russian Empire, but as a professional revolutionary preparing for its destruction. In 1893, Vladimir Ulyanov moved to St. Petersburg. He was 23 years old. The imperial capital was filled with palaces, government offices, factories, overcrowded workers' districts, police agents, and secret political circles. There, the young lawyer would enter the revolutionary underground. There, he would begin organizing workers. There, he would meet the woman who would share his life of conspiracy and exile. And there, the imperial police would finally begin to understand that the quiet younger brother of Alexander Ulyanov had become a danger of his own. Alexander had tried to kill a Tsar. Vladimir intended to destroy the world that made the Tsar possible. In 1893, Vladimir Ulyanov arrived in St. Petersburg. He was 23 years old. He carried a law qualification, a disciplined mind, and a growing conviction that the Russian Empire could not be reformed through petitions or isolated acts of violence. St. Petersburg was the political heart of the empire. It was a city of imperial palaces, ministries, military barracks, police offices, and magnificent avenues. But beyond its ceremonial center stood another city, a city of factories, crowded workers' districts, cheap lodging houses, long shifts, low wages, industrial accidents, and men and women who had left the countryside only to discover a new form of dependence inside the modern factory. Russia was industrializing rapidly, but its political system remained autocratic. The new working class was growing inside a state that allowed no legal opposition party, no free national press, and no independent labor movement. To Vladimir, this combination created the possibility of revolution. The workers were concentrated together. They shared similar hardships. They could be organized. And unlike the peasant communities idealized by earlier Russian populists, industrial workers stood directly inside the economic system described by Karl Marx. Vladimir entered St. Petersburg's underground Marxist circles. These were small groups of students, intellectuals, and workers who met quietly in private rooms. They studied economics, read forbidden literature, discuss factory conditions, and try to understand how Marxist theory could be applied to Russia. The meetings were dangerous. Police agents watched universities, printing shops, boarding houses, and known political suspects. A careless letter could expose an entire network. A single informer could send dozens of people to prison. Vladimir proved unusually effective in the secret world. He could explain difficult economic ideas clearly. He prepared lectures for workers. He gathered information about wages, working hours, fines, and factory discipline. He argued that revolutionaries should not speak only in abstract language about the distant overthrow of capitalism. They should begin with the problems workers experience every day. An illegal leaflet about unpaid wages could teach a worker that his individual grievance was part of a larger class relationship. A strike could become more than a demand for money. It could become a school of political struggle. During this period, Vladimir met Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya. She came from an educated but financially insecure family. She had worked as a teacher and participated in Marxist discussion circles. In the evenings, she taught workers at a Sunday school in St. Petersburg. The classroom gave her direct contact with the people the revolutionaries hoped to organize. Krupskaya was not simply a future leader's wife. She was an activist in her own right. She understood underground organization. She maintained contacts, managed correspondence, studied education, and shared Vladimir's belief that a disciplined political movement had to be built patiently. Their relationship developed within the work of the revolutionary underground. They read together, debated politics, visited workers, and participated in a network where personal trust could determine whether an organization survived. Vladimir was intense and demanding. He disliked vagueness. He expected arguments to lead toward action. Krupskaya was quieter, but highly organized and dependable. These qualities would later make her essential to the networks connecting Lenin with revolutionary groups across Russia. By 1895, several Marxist circles in St. Petersburg were moving toward cooperation. Vladimir helped unite them in an organization that became known as the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. The name expressed a major change. The revolutionaries did not want to remain a private reading group. They wanted to connect socialist theory with the real struggles taking place inside factories. The League produced leaflets aimed at specific workplaces. Its members investigated conditions and responded to strikes. They tried to show workers that factory owners, government officials, and the autocratic state were not separate problems. They were parts of the same political order. Vladimir believed economic agitation could bring workers into collective action. But he did not believe wage struggles alone were enough. Workers had to become conscious of the wider system confronting them. The police state, the censorship system, the courts, the autocracy, and the capitalist relationships developing throughout Russia. In 1895, Vladimir traveled outside Russia. He met veteran Marxists living in exile, including Georgy Plekhanov. Plekhanov had helped introduce Marxism into Russian revolutionary thought. For Vladimir, meeting him connected the young St. Petersburg organizer with an older generation of Russian socialism. Vladimir returned carrying ideas, contacts, and plans for a broader political movement. He wanted an illegal newspaper capable of linking the scattered Marxist circles operating in different cities. Without regular communication, local organizations remain isolated. One group might be arrested without others even knowing. A strike in one industrial center might have no effect elsewhere. A national newspaper could circulate reports, arguments, instructions, and a common political program. It could help turn disconnected circles into a party. But before this plan could be realized, the Imperial police struck. On the night of December 8, 1895, according to the calendar then used in Russia, Vladimir was arrested in St. Petersburg. Other members of the League were taken as well. The police had been monitoring their activities. Documents and revolutionary materials were seized. Vladimir was placed in pretrial detention. Prison removed him from the factories and meeting rooms, but it did not stop his political work. He read, wrote, developed economic arguments, and tried to maintain communication with comrades outside. The authorities held him for more than a year while investigating the underground organization. He was not put through a dramatic public trial. The imperial system had another method for dealing with political enemies: administrative exile. A person could be sent thousands of kilometers away from the political centers of the empire and placed under police supervision. In February 1897, Vladimir was sent to Siberia. His destination was Shushenskoye, a village in the Minsk region. The journey carried him far from St. Petersburg, far from its factories, far from the underground circles he had helped organize. Siberia had long served the empire as a place of punishment and removal. Its vast distances made escape difficult. A revolutionary sent there could be separated from associates for years. Yet Vladimir's exile was not imprisonment in a labor camp. He lived under supervision in the village. He received an allowance. He could read, walk, hunt, write, and correspond within restrictions. For a man with his capacity for concentrated work, exile became a period of study. He gathered material on Russian agriculture, industry, markets, and social change. He wanted to prove that capitalism was not merely a foreign system being imposed upon Russia from outside. It was already transforming the Russian countryside. Peasants were becoming divided by wealth. Markets were expanding. Traditional village relationships were breaking apart. Laborers were being drawn toward wage work. Russia, he argued, could not escape capitalist development by returning to an idealized peasant past. While Vladimir remained in Shushenskoye, Krupskaya was also arrested for revolutionary activity. She was sentenced to exile and requested permission to join him, identifying herself as his fiancée. The authorities allowed it on the condition that they marry. In July 1898, Vladimir Ulyanov and Nadezhda Krupskaya were married in Siberia. Their life together would rarely resemble a conventional household. There would be no permanent home for many years. Their marriage would be shaped by coded letters, false names, political conferences, border crossings, police surveillance, and long periods of uncertainty. Krupskaya assisted his research and shared his revolutionary work. She also wrote about the conditions of women workers, treating their oppression as both economic and social. During these years, Vladimir completed one of his first major books. The Development of Capitalism in Russia was published in 1899 under the name Vladimir Lenin. The work was dense and statistical rather than dramatic, but it served an important political purpose. It attacked the populist belief that the Russian village might bypass capitalist development. Vladimir argued that capitalism had already entered rural life and was creating class divisions from which a modern revolutionary movement could emerge. While he worked in Siberia, Russian Marxists attempted to create a national political party. In March 1898, a small Congress met in Minsk and declared the foundation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Vladimir did not attend. He was still in exile. The new organization was fragile. Many of its participants were soon arrested. It had a name, but not yet the centralized structure Vladimir believed was necessary. The failure reinforced his conclusion. Russian revolutionaries did not merely need courage. They needed continuity, professional organization, secrecy, a national political strategy, and a newspaper capable of holding the movement together when arrests destroyed local leadership. In early 1900, Vladimir's term of Siberian exile ended. He was forbidden from settling freely in the empire's largest political and industrial centers. He chose Pskov, where he could maintain contact with activists while preparing his next move. For several months, he traveled, met underground organizers, and sought support for the newspaper he had imagined before his arrest. Then, in July 1900, he left Russia for Western Europe. He was no longer simply Vladimir Ulyanov, the younger brother of an executed revolutionary. He had become an experienced organizer. a former political prisoner, a Siberian exile, a Marxist writer, and a man convinced that the Russian revolutionary movement had to be rebuilt around discipline and central direction. Soon, the newspaper would have a name: Iskra, the spark. Its purpose was contained in an old revolutionary image. From a spark, a flame would rise, and Vladimir Ulyanov intended to make sure that flame reached every corner of the Russian Empire. When Vladimir Ulyanov left Russia in the summer of 1900, he did not see exile as an escape. He saw it as a position from which to build a revolutionary organization. Inside Russia, the police could raid an apartment, seize a printing press, arrest an entire committee, and destroy years of work in a single night. Beyond the empire's borders, revolutionaries had greater freedom to meet, publish, and argue. But distance created another problem. A newspaper printed in Europe was useless unless it could cross the Russian frontier. It had to be hidden inside luggage, packed into false bottom cases, carried by trusted couriers, transferred through safe houses, and delivered to workers and underground committees without leading the police back to the people who produced it. Vladimir settled in Munich in September 1900. There, working with veteran Russian Marxists, he helped create the newspaper he had imagined before his arrest. Its name was Iskra, the spark. The first issue appeared in Leipzig in December 1900. Later issues were produced in Munich, then London, and eventually Geneva. The paper's purpose was not merely to report events. It was intended to unite scattered social democratic organizations across the Russian Empire around a common political program. The editorial group included important figures from the Russian Marxist movement: Georgy Plekhanov, Pavel Axelrod, Vera Zasulich, Alexander Potrasov, Julius Martov, and Vladimir Ulyanov. These were not obedient followers gathered around one unquestioned leader. They were experienced intellectuals with their own reputation, friendships, and political views. For the moment, they shared a goal. They wanted to transform the fragile Russian Social Democratic Labor Party from a name created at a failed Congress into a functioning national movement. Krupskaya joined Vladimir abroad in 1901 after completing her own term of exile. She became deeply involved in the organization surrounding Iskra. Correspondence arrived from Russia under false names. Letters contained coded information about committees, arrests, printing operations, and local disputes. Krupskaya helped maintain the connections between the editorial center abroad and activists working inside the empire. A revolutionary newspaper was not simply paper and ink. It was a network. Every address had to be protected. Every courier had to be trusted. Every careless phrase could expose another person to prison. Around this time, Vladimir began using the pseudonym by which history would remember him: Lenin. He had already written under other names, and the exact origin of this particular name remains uncertain. By the end of 1901, however, the name Lenin had begun to replace Ulyanov in his political publications. It was more than protection from the police. A revolutionary identity was taking shape. The provincial lawyer from Simbirsk was becoming a political figure known across the underground movement. Lenin worked with extraordinary intensity. He wrote articles, edited submissions, argued over wording, studied reports from Russia, and pushed Iskra toward one central question: what kind of organization could overthrow an autocratic state? This question produced one of his most influential and controversial works. In 1902, Lenin published What Is to Be Done. The title had been used before by the Russian writer Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose novel had inspired generations of radicals. Lenin's book was not a romantic story of revolutionary sacrifice. It was an argument about political organization. Some social democrats emphasized what became known as economism. They focused primarily on wages, hours, strikes, and immediate workplace demands. They believed political consciousness could develop gradually from the workers' economic struggle. Lenin considered this inadequate. He did not oppose strikes or demands for better conditions. He believed those struggles were essential, but he feared that, without a broader political organization, they would remain limited. Workers might win higher wages from one factory owner, while the police state remained untouched. They might reduce working hours while censorship, autocracy, and political repression continued. Lenin wanted economic struggle joined to a national campaign against the entire imperial system. For that purpose, he argued for an organization of professional revolutionaries. These people would devote themselves to underground political work. They would learn secrecy, printing, communication, false identities, political education, and resistance to police infiltration. The organization had to survive when individual members were arrested. It needed continuity stronger than any single local circle. The famous arguments of what is to be done were written for the conditions of underground Russia in 1901 and 1902, when legal party organization was impossible and local committees were repeatedly destroyed by the police. Lenin presented the all-Russian political newspaper as both a means of communication and a practical organizer of the movement. To his supporters, this was realism. The Tsarist government was centralized, disciplined, and violent. A loose movement of discussion groups could not defeat it. To his critics, Lenin's approach gave too much authority to a narrow political center. They feared that discipline could silence disagreement, that the organization might begin to treat independent thought as disobedience, and that a party created to liberate the working class might eventually command from above. These disagreements were not yet a final split. Lenin and Martov had worked closely together. Both had helped build Iskra. Both wanted a Marxist workers' party. Both opposed the autocracy. But beneath their cooperation lay different instincts. Martov was more comfortable with a broad political movement containing activists with different levels of involvement. Lenin wanted clearer boundaries. A party member, in his view, should belong to a party organization and accept its discipline. The disagreement appeared technical. It was not. It concerned who belonged to the Revolutionary Party, who could make decisions, and how much control the central organization should exercise over its members. In the summer of 1903, delegates gathered for the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The meeting began in Brussels, but pressure from the Belgian authorities forced it to move to London. Delegates had traveled under false identities. Some represented committees operating inside Russia. Others represented exile organizations. They debated the party program, national questions, organizational rules, and the future of Iskra. The Congress was intended to create unity. Instead, it revealed how fragile that unity had always been. The most famous dispute concerned the first paragraph of the party rules. Lenin proposed that a party member should accept the program, support the party financially, and personally participate in one of its organizations. Martov proposed a broader definition. A member could provide regular personal assistance under the direction of a party organization without formally belonging to it. Martov's wording initially won the vote. But the conflict did not end there. Arguments over representation, authority, and the election of the party's central bodies became increasingly bitter. Some delegates left the Congress during other disputes. The balance of votes changed. Lenin's supporters then won important later decisions, including elections concerning the central leadership and the reduced editorial board of Iskra. From these changing majorities came two names: Bolshevik, meaning a member of the majority; Menshevik, meaning a member of the minority. The name suggested a clear and permanent division. At first, the reality was less simple. The majority had shifted during Congress. The factions were not yet fully separate parties. Many social democrats were confused by the bitterness of the dispute and hoped the two sides would reconcile. But the names remained. And once political groups receive names, those names can harden temporary disagreements into permanent identities. Lenin emerged as the leading figure of the Bolshevik tendency. Martov became the central figure among the Mensheviks. Their personal friendship collapsed beneath organizational conflict. For Lenin, the issue was principle. A revolutionary party could not survive if Congress decisions were ignored whenever defeated members disliked the result. For Martov and his supporters, Lenin's conduct appeared rigid and excessively controlling. They accused him of trying to impose a state of siege inside the party. Lenin believed they were placing personal relationships above organizational discipline. The struggle spread from Congress sessions into letters, pamphlets, committees, and editorial offices. The newspaper created to unite the movement became part of the division. After the Congress, Plekhanov moved toward reconciliation with the former editors who had not been re-elected. Lenin opposed restoring the old editorial arrangement against the decisions of the Congress. In November 1903, he resigned from the editorial board. Iskra then passed into control of the Menshevik tendency. Lenin had helped create the spark. Now he had lost it, but he did not retreat. In 1904, he published One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. The title captures view of what had happened. The party had taken a step forward by holding a real Congress, adopting a program, and electing central institutions. Then it had moved backward into factional conflict. Lenin examined the Congress in exhausting detail. Votes, speeches, alliances, changes of position. To an outsider, the dispute could look small: a fight over membership wording, an argument over several newspaper editors. But Lenin believed the conflict revealed two different ideas of revolutionary politics. One favored a tightly organized party capable of acting as a disciplined force. The other favored a broader and more flexible political association. Neither side understood exactly where the division would lead. Neither could know that the words Bolshevik and Menshevik would one day become attached to revolution, civil war, governments, armies, and death. In 1904, there were still factions inside a persecuted movement. The Tsar remained on the throne. The imperial police remained powerful. The socialist underground remained small. Lenin had no army, no territory, no public office. He did not even control the newspaper he had founded. Yet the organization he imagined was beginning to take form. A hardened political core, connected by secret communications, educated through argument, trained by arrest and exile, prepared to treat revolution not as a sudden emotional uprising, but as a struggle requiring leadership, timing, and power. Soon, events inside Russia would test every theory. Workers would march through the snow toward the Winter Palace. Soldiers would fire into the crowd. Strikes would spread across the empire. Sailors would mutiny. Peasants would attack estates. And Lenin would return to Russia to confront the first revolution of his lifetime. The spark had been created. Now the empire was approaching the flame. In January 1905, Vladimir Lenin was living in Geneva when the Russian Empire began to shake. Russia was losing a costly war against Japan. Food prices were rising. Factory workers were angry. Peasants remained desperate for land. And confidence in Tsar Nicholas II was weakening. On January 22nd, according to the modern calendar, thousands of workers and their families marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Many carried religious icons. Some carried portraits of the Tsar. They were led by the priest Georgy Gapon and hoped to present a petition asking for better working conditions, civil rights, and protection from abusive officials. Nicholas II was not inside the palace. Troops blocked the marchers. Then soldiers opened fire. The exact number killed remains uncertain, but the event became known as Bloody Sunday. The belief that the Tsar might act as a benevolent father to his suffering people was shattered for many Russians. Strikes spread. Universities erupted. Peasants attacked estates. National movements challenged imperial authority. Even sections of the armed forces began to rebel. Lenin had spent years preparing for revolution. Yet, when the revolution arrived, it did not begin on his command. It began through a mixture of war, economic hardship, popular anger, and spontaneous action. This forced him to adapt. The disciplined underground party remained important, but events were moving faster than any central committee could control. Workers were creating new forms of political organization. The most important of these became known as Soviets. The Russian word simply meant councils. Delegates were chosen from factories and workplaces to coordinate strikes, distribute information, and represent workers across the city. These councils had not been designed in Lenin's study. They emerged from the practical needs of the struggle. Lenin recognized their importance. They could unite large numbers of workers beyond the membership of any single socialist faction. They might become instruments of uprising. They might also become the foundation of a new form of authority. But in 1905, their future remained uncertain. Lenin's immediate position was more radical than that of many Mensheviks. He argued that the revolution should not stop after winning a constitution or a limited parliament. The working class should ally with the peasantry, overthrow the autocracy, establish a democratic republic, and push the revolution as far as the balance of forces allowed. In Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, written during the summer of 1905, he insisted that the workers' movement must retain its political independence and not allow liberal elites to bring the struggle to an early end through compromise with the monarchy. Lenin also changed his thinking about the size of the party. The organization had needed strict secrecy during the years of police repression. Now thousands of workers were entering political life. Lenin urged the Bolsheviks to open their ranks more widely while preserving an underground structure in case the government regained control. This was characteristic of him. He defended discipline, but he was not committed to one organizational formula regardless of circumstances. When conditions changed, tactics had to change with them. In October 1905, a general strike paralyzed much of the empire. Railways stopped. Factories closed. Government communication weakened. Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and an elected legislative assembly known as the State Duma. Liberals celebrated concessions. Some believed the revolution had achieved its main objective. Lenin remained suspicious. The monarchy had made promises because it was weak. It could withdraw them once it recovered its strength. He returned to Russia in November, entering a country he had not seen for years. He lived under false names and changed residences to avoid arrest. He attended meetings, wrote for Bolshevik publications, and pushed the movement to prepare for a deeper confrontation. He believed an armed uprising might still overthrow the regime. But the revolutionary wave was already beginning to divide. The government negotiated with moderate opponents while concentrating reliable troops. Some workers were exhausted. Some soldiers remained loyal. The different centers of rebellion were poorly coordinated. In December, an uprising began in Moscow. Workers built barricades and armed detachments resisted government forces. The fighting was brave but uneven. The revolutionaries lacked sufficient weapons, unified command, and support from the wider army. Government artillery and troops crushed the resistance. Arrests followed. Soviets were broken apart. Leaders were imprisoned or sent into exile. The monarchy had survived. It created a Duma, but the Tsar retained enormous authority. Electoral rules were later changed to favor property owners and conservative social groups. Repression returned with executions, imprisonment, surveillance, and exile. Lenin refused to describe 1905 as meaningless. The workers had learned mass strikes, organization, armed resistance, and political action. The state had been forced to reveal both its weakness and its capacity for violence. For Lenin, 1905 became a rehearsal rather than a conclusion. But rehearsal had ended in defeat, and defeat demanded another retreat. By late 1907, Lenin had again left the Russian Empire. The second period of exile was longer and often more difficult than the first. He lived in Geneva, Paris, Krakow, and other European cities. The revolutionary movement weakened. Membership declined. Police informers penetrated party organizations. Many former activists abandoned underground work. Others argued that the party should focus on legal trade unions, cultural associations, and elections to the Duma. Lenin opposed abandoning a legal organization, but he also supported using every legal opportunity available. Bolshevik deputies could speak in the Duma. Workers could use newspapers and unions. The underground and legal struggle had to reinforce one another. The years after 1905 were also filled with conflict inside the socialist movement. Bolsheviks argued with Mensheviks. Bolsheviks argued among themselves. Lenin attacked former allies over philosophy, party finances, electoral tactics, and the future of the movement. He could be patient with political hardship. He was far less patient with ideological disagreement. To supporters, this protected the movement from confusion. To critics, it made cooperation increasingly impossible. In January 1912, a Bolshevik-led conference met in Prague. Lenin treated it as an authoritative party conference, although Mensheviks and several other groups rejected that claim. The gathering elected a new central committee dominated by Lenin supporters. The old factional division was becoming a practical separation. That April, the first issue of the daily newspaper Pravda appeared legally in St. Petersburg. It faced censorship, fines, confiscations, and repeated closures, but it gave the Bolsheviks a regular connection with workers inside Russia. Then Europe entered a disaster greater than the revolution of 1905. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand helped trigger a chain of mobilizations and declarations of war. Russia entered the First World War against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Millions of soldiers marched toward the front. Across Europe, socialist parties that had promised international solidarity largely supported their own governments. Lenin was stunned and furious. He saw the war not as a noble defense of civilization, but as a struggle among competing empires for markets, territory, and power. He rejected calls for national unity. He argued that socialist workers should oppose their own ruling classes and transform the imperialist war into revolutionary struggle. This position isolated him even among anti-war socialists. At the Zimmerwald Conference in Switzerland in 1915, he led a small left-wing group that demanded a sharper revolutionary break with the parties supporting the war. Most delegates favored peace, but were unwilling to accept Lenin's full program. During the war, Lenin continued studying capitalism and empire. In 1916, he completed imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He argued that modern capitalism had become dominated by large banks, monopolies, financial interests, colonial competition, and the export of capital. For Lenin, the war was not an accidental failure of diplomacy. It grew from the structure of the world economy. As the conflict continued, Russia suffered catastrophic losses. Weapons and supplies failed to reach soldiers consistently. Transport systems broke down. Food shortages worsened. Inflation damaged urban life. The monarchy appeared increasingly incapable of governing. Yet Lenin remained in Switzerland. He was far from Petrograd. The Bolshevik organization inside Russia had been weakened by arrests. Many of its leading members doubted that revolution was close. In January 1917, Lenin told a gathering that older revolutionaries might not live to see the coming revolution. Only weeks later, news reached Zurich that crowds had filled the streets of Petrograd. Women workers had protested over bread. Factories had gone on strike. Soldiers had refused orders and joined the demonstrators. The government had collapsed. Nicholas II had abdicated. The Romanov Empire Lenin had spent his life fighting had fallen without him. He read the telegrams with disbelief and urgency. For nearly a decade, he had waited in exile. Now Russia had a revolution, but not yet the revolution he wanted. A provisional government had taken power. Workers and soldiers were forming Soviets once again. The war continued. The future remained open. Lenin understood that every day away from Russia was a day in which other men would decide what the revolution became. He had to return. And when he did, he would demand what even many Bolsheviks considered impossible. No support for the new government. No continuation of the war. No compromise with the political order that had replaced the Tsar. All power to the Soviets. The empire had broken. Lenin was preparing to seize what remained. Lenin returned to Russia through a country that was officially at war with the land carrying him home. Most direct routes were blocked. Britain and France had little reason to help an anti-war revolutionary return to Petrograd. Germany did. German officials believed that Lenin and other exiled socialists might weaken Russia's willingness to continue the First World War. The journey later became famous as the passage of the sealed train. In practice, the carriage traveled under a special arrangement intended to keep the Russian émigrés politically separate from German territory. Lenin accepted the route because he saw no faster way back to the revolution. Germany expected disruption. Lenin intended revolution. Those two purposes briefly traveled on the same railway. On April 16, 1917, using the modern calendar, Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station. Workers, soldiers, Bolshevik activists, and members of the Petrograd Soviet gathered to welcome him. A ceremonial reception had been prepared. Many expected Lenin to support the broad revolutionary unity that had developed after the fall of the Tsar. Instead, he immediately challenged the political assumptions of nearly everyone around him. From an armored vehicle outside the station, he greeted the revolution. But he did not celebrate the provisional government. He treated it as the next obstacle. The Romanov monarchy had fallen. For Lenin, that did not mean the revolution was complete. It meant the first barrier had been removed. Russia now lived under what revolutionaries called dual power. The provisional government formally administered the country. It controlled ministries and claimed the authority of the state. But the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies possessed influence over factories, garrisons, railways, and the armed population of Petrograd. The government had legal authority. The Soviets had organized mass support. Neither side fully controlled the other. For a short time, the two existed beside one another. Lenin believed that balance could not last. One power would eventually destroy the other. The question was which one would act first. The next day, Lenin presented the arguments later known as the April Theses. He called for no political support to the provisional government. He demanded an end to Russia's participation in the imperialist war. He called for land to be transferred away from the great landowners. And he argued that political power should pass to the Soviets. He did not propose an immediate reckless attack by a small party. At that moment, the Bolsheviks were still a minority. Lenin insisted that they patiently explain their program until workers and soldiers abandoned the moderate socialist leaders who supported cooperation with the government. Many Bolsheviks were shocked. Before Lenin's return, important party figures had taken a more cautious position. They believed Russia was passing through a democratic revolution. They expected some period of parliamentary government before any socialist transformation became possible. Lenin rejected the idea that the party should simply wait for history to move through a predetermined schedule. The war had broken the old state. Workers had created Soviets. Soldiers were armed and politically active. The revolution, he argued, had produced conditions that required a new strategy. His confidence did not immediately persuade everyone. Some old comrades thought he had become detached from Russian reality during exile. But Lenin argued relentlessly. At meetings, in newspapers, inside party committees, he pushed the Bolsheviks away from conditional cooperation and toward open opposition. His slogans were simple enough to travel beyond intellectual circles. Peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. The provisional government could not easily satisfy any of these demands. It continued the war because its leaders feared military defeat, diplomatic isolation, and the loss of Russia's commitments to its allies. It delayed a final decision on land until a future constituent assembly. It struggled to supply the cities. Every delay created another opportunity for the Bolsheviks. Lenin's program gained strength not because every worker had studied Marxist theory, but because the government repeatedly failed to resolve the emergencies destroying ordinary life. In June 1917, the government launched a major military offensive. The attack was associated with the new war minister, Alexander Kerensky. Early gains were followed by collapse. Discipline at the front continued to disintegrate. Soldiers deserted. Casualties increased. The offensive damaged the government's authority and strengthened those who had opposed continuing the war. In Petrograd, anger spread among soldiers and workers who feared that military units might be sent back to the front. At the beginning of July, armed demonstrations erupted in the capital. Soldiers, sailors, and workers entered the streets demanding that the Soviets take power. These events became known as the July Days. The demonstrations were larger and more radical than the Bolshevik leadership had planned. Some local Bolsheviks encouraged them. Others feared the movement had begun too early. Lenin faced a dangerous choice. If the party openly attempted to seize power without support across the country, it might be isolated and destroyed. If it abandoned the demonstrators completely, it could lose credibility among its most militant supporters. The Bolsheviks tried to give the movement political direction while avoiding an immediate attempt to overthrow the government. The effort failed to prevent violence and disorder. Government forces regained control. The authorities accused the Bolsheviks of organizing an armed uprising and of serving German interests. Party offices were raided. Newspapers were closed. Leon Trotsky and other leaders were arrested. A warrant was issued for Lenin. Rather than submit to a trial he believed would be used to destroy him politically, Lenin went into hiding. Disguised and protected by trusted supporters, he escaped from Petrograd and eventually crossed into Finland. Only weeks earlier, he had spoken publicly before crowds. Now he lived in concealment, uncertain whether the party he had spent years building would survive. The July defeat appeared to confirm the fears of Lenin's critics. The Bolsheviks had been discredited. Their leaders were imprisoned or hidden. The government had restored order. Kerensky became prime minister. Yet beneath the surface, the state remained weak. The war continued. The economy worsened. Land seizures spread through the countryside. Soldiers distrusted their officers. Workers suspected employers of attempting to close factories and defeat the revolution through hunger. Then came the Kornilov affair. General Lav Kornilov, commander-in-chief of the Russian army, believed that discipline had collapsed and that stronger authority was necessary. In August, troops under his command moved toward Petrograd. The exact intentions and communications between Kornilov and Kerensky remained debated. But Kerensky came to believe that the general threatened the government. He dismissed Kornilov and called upon the Soviets and workers to help defend the capital. The Bolsheviks, recently treated as traitors, were suddenly needed. Workers received weapons. Railway employees disrupted troop movements. Political organizers persuaded soldiers not to advance. Kornilov's effort collapsed without a major battle. The affair damaged conservative authority and weakened Kerensky. It also transformed the Bolsheviks. They could now present themselves as the determined defenders of the revolution against military counter-revolution. Party prisoners were released. Armed workers kept many of their weapons. Support for the Bolsheviks grew rapidly in the cities and garrisons. By September, the Bolsheviks had won majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Trotsky became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. From hiding in Finland, Lenin followed the change with urgency. He had once told the party to explain patiently. Now, he believed the moment for patience was ending. The provisional government was weak. The Bolsheviks had growing support in the major urban centers. The army was disintegrating. The countryside was moving toward uncontrolled land revolution. Lenin warned that waiting for elections or another formal Congress could give the government time to recover, surrender Petrograd, or suppress the party again. He sent letters demanding preparations for an armed insurrection. Some Bolshevik leaders resisted him. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev believed the party lacked sufficient national support. They feared isolation and civil war. Others wanted power transferred to the upcoming Congress of Soviets rather than through a party-led seizure beforehand. Lenin treated delay as the greatest danger. A revolution, he believed, could not be scheduled like a conference. There were moments when power stood unprotected. If the Revolutionary Party failed to take it, an enemy would. In October, Lenin secretly returned to Petrograd. He wore a disguise and entered the city while still wanted by the authorities. At meetings of the Bolshevik Central Committee, he pressed a case for insurrection. After intense argument, the committee approved preparations. The Petrograd Soviet created a military revolutionary committee, formally presented as a body for defending the capital. Trotsky became one of its principal organizers. Through the committee, the Bolsheviks established influence over Red Guards, sailors, soldiers, communications, and key positions across Petrograd. The coming seizure would not begin as a vast battle in the streets. It would begin as the quiet occupation of the machinery of the city. On November 6th, according to the modern calendar, the provisional government attempted to act. Authorities moved against Bolshevik newspapers and tried to control bridges and strategic sites. The Military Revolutionary Committee responded. During the night and following day, armed workers, soldiers, and sailors occupied railway stations, telegraph facilities, bridges, government buildings, and other critical locations. Resistance was limited. Much of Petrograd continued its ordinary life, while political power slipped from one government to another. Kerensky left the city seeking loyal troops. The remaining ministers gathered inside the Winter Palace. Lenin arrived at the Bolshevik headquarters at the Smolny Institute. After months of exile and hiding, he was once again at the center of events. He pressed for the government to be removed before the Congress of Soviets could meet and complicate the transfer of power. On the night of November 7th, forces supporting the Military Revolutionary Committee entered the Winter Palace. The later Soviet image of a massive heroic storming exaggerated the scale of the confrontation. There was confusion, scattered resistance, poorly defended entrances, and far less dramatic combat than later paintings and film suggested. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested. The government created after the fall of the Tsar had lasted only 8 months. At the Second Congress of Soviets, moderate socialist delegates denounced the seizure and walked out. Their departure left the Bolsheviks and their allies with greater control over the proceedings. Lenin appeared before the Congress. The underground organizer, the exile, the fugitive accused of treason. He now stood as the leader of a new government. The Russian Empire had already lost its Tsar. Now the political order that replaced him had also fallen. Lenin had spent years arguing that courage without organization would fail. In October 1917, organization met opportunity. And for the first time, Vladimir Lenin possessed what his brother Alexander had never reached. Not a bomb aimed at the ruler, not a pamphlet condemning the system, but state power itself. Lenin had reached a position he had pursued for most of his adult life. The old monarchy was gone. The provisional government had fallen, and the Bolsheviks controlled the capital. But taking power was far easier than keeping it. Russia remained trapped in war. The economy was collapsing. The countryside was seizing land without waiting for government permission. The army was disintegrating. And across the former empire, political movements, national groups, military commanders, and rival socialist parties were preparing to resist the new government. Lenin became chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. His government immediately issued decrees calling for peace and recognizing the transfer of landed estates to peasant committees. Factories and banks increasingly passed under state control. Old ranks and privileges were abolished. The Bolsheviks presented these measures as the beginning of government by workers and peasants. Yet power was already becoming concentrated in the hands of one party. In December 1917, the government created the Chaika, an emergency political police organization led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. It was initially presented as a temporary weapon against sabotage and counter-revolution. It would soon become one of the central instruments of Bolshevik repression. The Bolsheviks had also promised elections to a constituent assembly. When that assembly met in January 1918, the socialist revolutionaries held the largest bloc, while the Bolsheviks were a minority. Lenin argued that the Soviets represented a higher and more revolutionary form of authority than a parliamentary assembly elected before the political divisions of the countryside were fully clear. When the assembly refused to recognize Soviet power and its decrees, it was dissolved after a single session. Russia's first broadly elected national parliament disappeared almost as soon as it had opened. The revolution would not develop into a multi-party parliamentary republic. The most urgent problem was the First World War. The Russian army was exhausted, but Germany continued to advance. Lenin believed the new regime could not survive unless it obtained peace immediately. Many Bolsheviks opposed accepting Germany's harsh conditions. They hoped revolution would spread westward or argued for a revolutionary war. Lenin insisted that the Soviet government needed time. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The treaty removed Russia from the war, but at an enormous cost. The former empire lost control over vast territories and populations in Eastern Europe. To Lenin, the agreement was humiliating but necessary. A government without an effective army could not defeat Germany through revolutionary determination alone. Peace with Germany did not bring peace to Russia. Civil war spread across the country. The Bolsheviks, now increasingly known as communists, faced a collection of enemies, usually described as the whites. Some white leaders wanted the monarchy restored. Others favored military dictatorship, liberal government, or restored constituent assembly. Nationalist movements fought for independence. Cossack forces defended regional power. Foreign troops from Britain, France, Japan, the United States, and other countries intervened in different parts of the former empire. The conflict was not one simple war between two united sides. It was a shifting struggle involving armies, guerrillas, peasant forces, local governments, and competing national projects. Leon Trotsky organized a Red Army. Former imperial officers supplied military experience, while political commissars monitored their loyalty. The Reds controlled the central industrial regions, including Moscow and Petrograd. They possessed major railway connections and could move forces between distant fronts. Their enemies were divided geographically and politically. White armies often failed to offer peasants a convincing answer to the land question. By 1920, the principal white forces had been defeated, but Bolshevik victory came through mass mobilization, coercion, military discipline, and immense suffering. During the war, Lenin's government introduced policies later called war communism. Large industries were nationalized. Private trade was restricted. Money lost much of its practical value. Armed detachments requisitioned grain from peasants to feed the cities and the Red Army. The policies helped direct scarce supplies toward the war effort, but they also damaged production and intensified hostility in the countryside. Peasants had little reason to produce surpluses that could be taken from them. Factories stood idle. Cities lost population as hungry residents returned to villages. War, economic breakdown, requisitioning, transport collapse, and later drought combined to create catastrophe. The Civil War also produced organized political terror. In August 1918, Lenin was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt after speaking at Moscow factory. The attack occurred during a period when the Bolsheviks were already facing military rebellion and violence from their opponents. The government answered with the Red Terror. The Cheka carried out arrests, hostage-taking, imprisonment, and executions against those identified as counter-revolutionaries or class enemies. White forces also committed massacres and terror in territories they controlled. But under Lenin, state repression became an accepted and systematic method of defending revolutionary power. The precise number of victims remains disputed. The political principle was clearer. Lenin believed violence could be justified when the survival of the revolution was at stake. By the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had survived. The country they ruled was devastated. Famine spread through major agricultural regions in 1921. Peasant uprisings challenged grain requisitioning. In Tambov province, a large rural rebellion required military suppression. At the Kronstadt naval base, sailors who had once supported the revolution demanded freer Soviet elections, civil liberties for socialist workers, and an end to coercive economic policies. The Bolshevik government described the rebellion as a threat to revolutionary power. Red Army forces crossed the frozen Gulf of Finland and crushed it in March 1921. For Lenin, Kronstadt was a warning. The government had won the Civil War, but was losing support of sections of the workers and peasants in whose name it ruled. Lenin responded with a dramatic economic retreat. At the 10th Party Congress, he introduced a new economic policy. Forced grain requisitioning was replaced with a tax in kind. After paying the tax, peasants could sell part of their produce. Small businesses and private trade were permitted to return. The state retained control of major industry, banking, transport, and foreign trade, but limited market activity was allowed to revive the economy. Lenin did not describe this as abandoning socialism. He considered it a strategic retreat taken because immediate economic transformation had gone further than Russia's ruined society could sustain. Economic rules became more flexible. Political power did not. The same party Congress that approved a new economic direction also prohibited organized factions inside the Communist Party. Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, and other political opponents were arrested, restricted, driven abroad, or forced underground. The Soviets remained, but genuine competition for national power disappeared. The Revolutionary Party, created to overthrow autocracy, had constructed a new centralized state. In December 1922, Soviet Russia joined with the Soviet republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation to create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Russian Empire had been broken apart by war and revolution. Many territories had achieved independence. Others were brought into a new union ruled from Moscow by the Communist Party. Lenin opposed openly Russian imperial language and insisted that the republics should formally possess equal rights. Yet the political system holding them together was highly centralized. The empire had not simply vanished. It had been rebuilt in a radically different ideological form. Lenin was increasingly unable to direct what he had created. In May 1922, he suffered a severe stroke. He partially recovered and returned to limited work, but further strokes followed. His ability to speak and move deteriorated. During his final active months, he dictated notes about the future leadership of the party. He warned that conflict between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky could divide the organization. He criticized several leading Bolsheviks. Most significantly, he wrote that Stalin had concentrated enormous power as general secretary and suggested that the party consider removing him from that position. Lenin had helped elevate Stalin. Now, weakened and isolated, he had begun to fear the way Stalin used authority. A final stroke in March 1923 left Lenin unable to speak and ended his political activity. He spent his remaining months at the estate of Gorky outside Moscow. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin died at the age of 53. The government transformed his funeral into a national ritual. His body was preserved and eventually placed in a mausoleum in Red Square. The man who had opposed religious authority became the center of a political cult built by those who inherited his state. Lenin had broken an empire. He had also created the foundations of another system of power. His government withdrew Russia from a destructive world war. It destroyed the legal privileges of the old aristocracy. It promised land, social equality, education, and government in the name of workers and peasants. It inspired revolutionary and anti-colonial movements far beyond Russia. But it also dissolved elected opposition, created a political police, used terror, crushed rival socialist movements, and established one-party rule. Stalin would later transform that system into something even more centralized and murderous. Yet Stalin did not inherit an empty structure. He inherited institutions, methods, and political assumptions that had already developed under Lenin. For his admirers, Lenin was a strategist who recognized a moment when an ancient order could be overthrown. For his critics, he replaced one form of authoritarian rule with another. Both judgments begin from the same undeniable fact. In 1917, Lenin led a party that had spent years in prisons, rented rooms, and fought in exile. 7 years later, that party governed one of the largest states on earth. The young man whose brother had died trying to kill a czar had achieved something far greater and far more consequential. He did not merely remove a ruler. He broke an empire. And from its ruins, he built a state that would shape the rest of the 20th century.